little bit about what it means to be the co-director of the clinical law program at Maryland, Carey.
So thank you, first of all, Renee and Lindsay, for the invitation and for putting together this series of conversations. And certainly I'm very, very happy to go before Allison, Layla, and Narinda, just given all their great work, and also happy anniversary to UDC. So right now I'm still co-directing the clinical program at Maryland, been co-director for a while now. Just, dealing with the day-to-day issues of a clinical law program, but also within the space of a law school that, similar to UDC, is really focused on, I'm sorry, you may hear some ambulances in the background, but very much focused on community and clinical pedagogy, but within the broader curriculum, right? So we're always, learning lessons and trying to improve, right? So it's just sort of the everyday grind of trying to be better today than you were yesterday. And I'm also now teaching a clinic. It's called a Youth Education and Justice Clinic that we started, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And so it's still a brand new clinic. And so I'm still, sort of climbing uphill, trying to really learn what it is I'm actually supposed to be doing in the classroom, as well as with the practice of it. So, I also like to challenge myself and take on sort of new areas of practice. And so I'm in the middle of that right now. So, yeah.
So how did you start as a clinician at Maryland? So when you came into academia, well, let me back up a little. Yeah. Did you come into academia at Maryland, or were you somewhere else before?
No. So that's a great question. So I was a public defender after law school in New York. I was at Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem, and I was at Office of the Appellate Defender, where Renee actually was before. She was there before I was. And then I did a fellowship. I did a cover, it's called the Robert Cover Fellowship at Yale. And I see Serge Martinez, I see his name up there. He was a student at Yale at the time. But so I began, how you doing, Serge? Good to see you. So that was my sort of pivot, if you will, if pivot is the right word, between sort of the everyday practice and teaching. I did a 2-year fellowship at Yale. And then after that, I was at St. John's for a year. And then I did a visit at Washington University in St. Louis. And then I came to Maryland. So I'm also happy to talk about, bouncing around and sort of, what that meant and how that impacted me.
Yeah. So can we unpack that just a little bit? So when you went to do the cover fellowship at Yale, did you know you wanted to move out of practice and into teaching, or sort of what inspired that jump?
Absolutely clueless. This was in no way a trajectory that I saw for myself. It was, nothing that had been really planned out. So I came out of law school and was a public defender in New York City at a very, very interesting time. Then Mayor Rudy Giuliani, there was a strike. Legal Aid Society went on strike in New York, which is the main provider of civil and criminal indigent services. In response to legal aid going on strike, Giuliani basically threatened to abolish legal aid. Yeah. And what he did was he then required that all the service providers of indigent defense had to submit requests for proposals every single year, right? And so, I was at Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem. NDS was very much threatened, if you will, by this process, because now instead of being a line item every single year you had to apply to stay in service. But this is also how organizations such as Bronx Defenders, the New York Defender Association, Brooklyn Defender Services, et cetera, how they came into existence, right? It was just a rocky time. And then I went to OAD, and Renee, you well know.
Which was another product of that RFP process.
Correct. And at the time, the OAD, it was a 2-year position, right? So staff attorneys, you were 2 years at OAD and then you were out. So, towards the end of my second year, I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do next. And, applied to a couple of other organizations, didn't really get the job. And then Bridget McCormick, who is now the Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court, talk about another trajectory for clinicians. But, I had always kind of followed her. We didn't overlap at law school at the same time, but she was always someone who I was told to follow. She was at legal aid. She was at OAD. So
Yep.
we overlapped a little bit at OAD. And then she was one of the first cover fellows at Yale. Okay. And so she suggested that I apply for this fellowship. And I guess I had some interest, obviously, in applying for it, maybe some interest in teaching, but nothing in any way solid. I applied, didn't think I was going to get it, and I got it, and I went up there, and it was the most amazing experience for me in terms of being introduced to clinical teaching in a way that was very sort of methodical and intentional. I had some great mentors there, Kathleen Sullivan, Brett Dignam, Steve Weisner, who, really showed me what it was to actually be a clinical teacher and also to engage in scholarship. So I think for many of us, I think we find that we sort of trip upon this opportunity. I don't know too many people who in law school said, I want to be a clinical law professor, at least back then. It all sort of, I think, happenstance just came into our lives at the time. So no, it was by no means intentional. And
so I'm assuming the cover fellow is term limited, right?
Correct, 2-year fellowship. So after the fellowship, I went on the market, went to St. John's for a year, then went to WashU for a year, and then came to Maryland. I was on the market, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 times.
Okay, and so what about the cover fellowship made you say, I'm going this way and not that way, right? Like, I'm not going to pivot back into practice, full-time practice. I'm going to stay over here in the academic lane.
It's interesting because I think, I'm sure, I imagine many of us have had this experience, when you're working for, legal services organizations, and one thing is the resources aren't really there, right? You're really strapped for resources. And then also we're pretty much confined with the work that we can do, right? You get this funding and the funding says you have to do X work and it's a struggle to do Y work, which is something we experienced at OAD, right? We were supposed to do direct appeals.
Yep.
We did habeas work at OAD, but it was always an issue that we were doing habeas work. One of the things that struck me, a couple of things that struck me about my experience as a fellow. First of all, just the opportunity to work with students who are really, really committed and who change every semester every year. So every semester, every year, there's a whole new group of students who, this is brand new to them, right? There's no burnout, everyone's really fully engaged and they challenge you, right? In ways that is the same today as it was, back then. Also being exposed to scholarship, at the time and the ways in which scholarship can be used as a vehicle to sort of partner with the everyday sort of efforts to reform and reimagine systems. That is, you could use a scholarship as an extension of your voice. That was introduced to me during the fellowship because Steve Weisner actually gave me the great advice. My first article, he says, think of what made you really upset in practice and write about it. And that was, my first article. And then the other thing was, again, just having access to resources that I didn't have before and really being able, I was exposed to different areas of law. Right. So the ability to sort of seek out new areas of law, to do different things, and then have the resources to do it are, the things that really stuck out to me back then and still stick out to me now.
And do you think that the fellowship made you more viable on the market? Like, so when you finally decided to make the jump and go on the market, did the fellowship help?
It helped. And I would love to circle back to this whole conversation about fellowships because I think we've gotten to the point where this sort of unhealthy reliance on fellowships that, maybe existed back then. I just didn't know it because I was in it. But I just think the market is much different now than it was back then in ways that I would love to talk about. But no, it certainly helped because in the fellowship, I was able to write an article that really helped when I was on the market. And it also, obviously, I think other schools saw it as a bonus, right? This is someone who's committed to clinical education. And it gave me the language, right? To be able to, it gave me the language that I needed, right? In the interviewing process. That is to show that I kind of know a little bit something about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that you say that. So when I first went on the market, and when I went on the market, because I interviewed in Maryland. That was the hardest jump for me, right? Like, so because I didn't come through a fellowship. And so making the jump from talking like an advocate and talking like a practicing lawyer to talking like an academic was incredibly hard for me. So if there are people on this call who are maybe in contract level clinical positions or aren't yet in a position and are thinking about doing it, or are you know, themselves adjuncts or attorneys on grants, would you recommend to them fellowship? So you said there's an unhealthy dependence on fellowship, but before we unpack that, and I hear you on that, before we unpack that, would you recommend them as a vehicle for competing aggressively to get a teaching position?
I would say yes and no. And it's one of those things where if you feel that you are in a position where you could do a fellowship, right? It doesn't hurt to do a fellowship.
So what does that mean? Why wouldn't you be in a position?
Right. So, and I think, you know, folks have written about this. When I did a fellowship, I didn't have a family, right? You know, I didn't have to worry about, you know, how much I was making. I didn't have anybody to support. And also I'll say for me, coming from a public defender background, the fellowship actually was a bump up for me. It was a step up, right? I think for a lot of people though, you know, they can't afford the fellowship because it doesn't pay enough for them to be able to meet all their other obligations, support who it is they need to support. So, you know, I did it. I was unattached. I didn't really have any attachments at all. And so I had the freedom, you know, if you will, to do it. So that's why I say yes and no, right? That is, if you have the ability to do it in that context, and if you think it's for you, then yes, I would recommend it. I would say no if it's not for you for those reasons, and maybe the other reasons as well. But I'll also say no in part because I think that, and we could talk about this as well, but I also think that those of us who've been doing this for a while, and I know many of us do this within our own institutions, but you know, these are continuous conversations within our institutions about the need to sort of, you know, not be so dependent on fellowships. I think that that's like that's the one place to really sort of look, because fellowships have essentially taken over, right? I mean, there are a bazillion non-clinical fellowships that are out there. And those of us who've been on hiring committees see, you know, the percentages of applicants who come from these fellowships, right? And so I think that we need to continue to have these conversations with our law schools. I know I've had it in mind. I know you all have had it as well, of telling our colleagues about how it is these fellowships aren't for everybody, really to educate them about what I just talked about the fellowships, like who gets these fellowships, who doesn't, who has the ability to get them, who just, you know, who just can't afford it. And to really be able to sort of look at candidates holistically. And really, you know, I think one big difference when I was on the market initially was schools would sort of say, okay, maybe you have one publication, maybe you have no publications, but, you know, we see you as somebody who, without mentoring, you know, you can get to this place where we need you to be. And I think that many law faculties have strayed from that and now are looking at these fellowships with people who publish 2 and 3 articles, you know, before they even hit the market, that in ways that I think are incredibly unhealthy, which in ways that exacerbate the racial and other disparities that are plaguing our faculties, you know, nationwide as well.
Do you think though, and so I hear you on that, I wonder though if there is a distinction to be made between clinical fellowship and podium teaching fellowships, right? Yeah. I think that one of the fair critiques about looking to fellowship primarily for the appointments process is that what you're hiring are essentially new law school grads, right? You're hiring people who really have had no time as a practicing attorney because they jumped from law school, maybe to a clerkship, maybe directly into a fellowship. And so they have no real world experience for podium teaching. But is that same critique fair for clinical teaching, or do fellowships provide, I know when I went on the market, I had the kernel of the thought of an idea. Like when I say I never would have been hired in today's market, I mean that. I never would have been hired in today's market. And so is it possible that clinical fellowships provide busy practitioners the space and time to write in a way that makes them more competitive, that, you know, it's a little bit different for podium teaching?
Oh, no, I agree 100%. I mean, certainly that's one of the things a fellowship could do, depending on the fellowship, because we could talk all day long about, you know, there are different types of fellowships. So there are fellowships that will provide that time and provide those resources, provide that mentoring. And there could be other fellowships that are just, you know, you just crank out cases and you don't have time to do all that, right? And so I agree that the right fellowship will give you that time and space, and there will be a benefit on the market. I agree with that 100%. I still have the same criticism, though, of faculties who would then use that as a proxy for a person being sort of more equipped to do the job over the long haul. And what I mean by that is, you know, I think we've seen candidates who've been out of law school 5, 7, 10 years who want to make this transition to clinical teaching. And I think there are some members of the faculty who would hold it against them, but they haven't produced a piece of scholarship. And then it's on us to say, well, there are reasons why, right? Because they're really, really busy. But looking at this person as a whole, these are the benefits we will get as an institution from this person. And if we really believe, I'm saying we very, very broadly, I'm really talking to the other faculty members here, right? But if we really, really believe that with this hot stuff, that we have all this ability to train, you know, scholars and to work with scholars, and then here we go. Here's a person that we could, you know, that we could help support in these ways. And so I think I would say the same, and I agree with you that maybe there's some, you know, different shades here, but again, this is why I think many of us have seen this time and time again, because we've had this conversation on our faculties over the course of, you know, years and decades at this point.
Okay, so you leave your cover fellowship and you go to St. John's.
Right.
Did you apply for both clinical and podium positions, or did you just apply for clinical positions because of your experience at Yale?
So I'm going to tell you something else. And you know this. So
all the tea, y'all. I'm just saying we get.
No. I'm gonna tell people just in terms of, you know, where I was at the time and my state of mind. First of all, no, I only applied to clinical positions. That was the only thing I even saw as being a possibility. And to answer your earlier question, I think you asked an earlier question as well. At every point, I've only applied for clinical positions. I've never applied for anything other than that. You know, I will say that when I did the cover fellowship in New Haven, that's the first time in my life I had left New York. So I had a very sort of, I was one of these people that when I went to New Haven, even though it's 80 miles from New York, I felt that, I might as well have been like in Berkeley. I felt I was that far away. And I think for me, you know, one of the things that I was really focused on leaving that fellowship is I needed to get back to New York, you know? But the other thing is, I think this is a larger lesson. The first year that I went on the market, there weren't really a lot of clinical jobs available. It was a really dry market that year. And that can happen, right? Some years the market is really, really, you know, explosive, and other years it could be pretty just dry. And so part of it is just the luck and you know, of that year. So anyway, went to St. John's, and then from there, it was a clinical position, and from there I did a visit at Washington University in St. Louis, and you know, when that opportunity first arose, I was not interested. I was at the point, and I don't really want to get into details about this part of it, but I was at the point where I was ready to pivot from clinical teaching and just get back to what I was doing before. All right, let's just say that.
You mean like full-time practice?
Yeah, I just didn't, I wasn't quite sure that this was for me, that it was in the cards for me, right? And when the visit, and it was a pure visit, when it was first introduced as a possibility at WashU, I was, I'd never been to the Midwest. So I was like, not even, I don't even need to talk about it. A couple months later, it's the same week. I think March 15th is still the deadline by which you could, you could take a visit from another school. So it was that very same week. It was, and March 15th was on a Friday. Sometime that week, WashU reached out and said, hey, look, would you like to do a visit here? I sight unseen, I said, yeah. I was at that point where—
Why? What made you say that?
I was at a fork in the road. Like either I'm going to do this teaching stuff or I'm not, right? And this will determine it for me. Went to WashU, best experience I've ever had in my life. Was exposed to a different city, St. Louis. I developed these mentors at WashU. And to your point, Renee, the condition of that visit, I would teach in a clinic and I had to teach legal profession, right?
You wanted that or they asked for that?
That was the condition of the visit.
Okay.
So to do this visit, it was a clinical visit, but I also needed to teach legal profession. So that was my introduction to podium teaching, which happens a lot. So a lot of times these visits, even if it's a clinical visit, they may want you to teach a seminar course or, a large course.
Well, yeah.
And the lesson here for me was, I'm so glad I did it, right? Because not only did it expose me just to, podium teaching, but it allowed me to meet more students, and it put me in a better position to go on the market again, right? Because I could teach these different things.
Gotcha.
I could say, right? Because legal profession, and still the case, is one of these classes that a law school always needs people to teach, right? I mean, that's one of those things where the associate deans, when they're trying to fill out the curriculum for each year, is like, okay, who am I going to get to teach legal profession? So from that, I learned that there's certain courses, and I think this is a lesson for clinical folks, right? If you have the opportunity to teach a seminar or, a larger class, it could increase your marketability. And
do you think
again,
that when clinicians are doing that, though, do you think that they should be negotiating with their deans or their associate deans for either a reduction in the number of students that they're teaching in the clinic or a semester out of the clinic, right? Do you think they should just add it on to what they are currently doing, or should they be asking for some relief with the clinical work?
I think I'm going to answer this, and I'm sure folks could disagree, and because I don't know that I have a right answer for that. Let me say that when I did this visit, I didn't have a choice.
Okay.
It was like, we need you to do X and Y. I'm like, cool, I'll do X and Y. I have to do it. But when I got hired in Maryland, again, I was hired as a clinical person. They also asked me to teach legal profession my first year, right? And I did not ask for that, for any kind of, relief in that way, in part because I didn't know to ask for it.
Right.
And maybe I didn't even think I could have asked for it. So I would say that one of the lessons I've learned moving forward is, yes, you should ask for that, right? And understand that, when you get this offer, whether it's for a visit or a full-time, position, that you at that point, they want you. And so you can ask for it. They may not give it to you, but you could ask for it. But it's also, I think, really, really important to advocate for yourself and explain why it is, you would need, a reduced number of students, so you would need a semester off. It's because you're focused on the teaching, you're really committed to it, and the scholarship and everything else that comes with it. So, I definitely think, looking back, that's something to ask for.
And would you recommend that clinicians teach outside of the clinic in their first or second year? So one of the things that I have sort of established as policy here at UDC, because our clinical law program is a very strong clinical law program, right. Number 6 in the nation. It's very important to me to keep that strong. And so as we are hiring people who have expressed an interest to teach in the clinic, one of the things that I ask them to do is stay in the clinic for 2 years, right? I ask them, I let them know that, because I view that as protected time, right? When I think about my own transition into clinical teaching, particularly because I hadn't come through a fellowship, that was like a brand new world. I didn't know what a syllabus was. I hadn't seen a syllabus in 10 years. I've been at law school 10, 11 years at that point. And so I think that setting up and teaching a clinic is a steeper climb than
Yes.
setting up and teaching a doctrinal course. And so it's my sense that you should protect your time in the first year or two and not teach outside of the clinic. But what advice would you give on that?
And I agree. I mean, I see that. And the couple, just to add a couple of points to that is, you know, the steep climb is due to a number of factors. So number one, it could be a new just practice jurisdiction for you.
Yep.
It's possible it's a new area of law for you.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, one of the first things I learned, my first political conference that I went to, I learned that people teach clinics in areas that they don't know too much about sometimes, right? Because of, you know, whatever curricular needs. And, you know, you're almost, you know, a step or two ahead of your students. But obviously there's a pedagogy that goes along with that. So the point is, the practice may be different. And even if it's not, the jurisdiction could be different. So, you know, how it is same subject area, but there's so differences in the new jurisdiction. Then you have to go out and meet, you know, other folks, right? The other stakeholders who are doing the work. You have to sort of, you know, begin the process of proving your legitimacy and earning their trust and partnering with them. So there's all of that. And then on top of that, you have to put your syllabus together. You have to put your classes together, all that stuff, all of that. That's a lot of work by itself. Then you have supervision, you're being evaluated, you know, you're trying to write, all of that going on. And doing a prep for a doctrinal class, seminar, you know, large class, et cetera, is also a ton of work. Yeah. Definitely agree, it's not as steep of a climb, but it's a ton of work. The amount of time that you spend putting a syllabus together and then prepping for one class, right? I mean, I think they say that for a podium class, you could expect, I'm talking about a big class, you could expect to, I mean, it could be 8 hours of prep for each class, yep. Right? A ton of work. So I definitely agree with what you're saying there. With that said, and look, you know, there are some clinical programs that don't want you teaching a seminar or podium class at all, right? You're there to teach that particular clinic. So I think part of it is, you know, you have to sort of see what institution you're going to and what would be allowed and even what would be expected. But if there's a way, look, I'm just going to say that I have gotten a lot out of also teaching outside of the clinic. Okay, that is, I think it has improved my clinical teaching. I think that there's stuff that I bring from the clinic into that teaching that, quite honestly, students may not be getting, you know, otherwise. Selfishly, it's a way for me to meet many more students, you know, in the law school. And I think that to the extent that we can pervade the curriculum, it's really, you know, I think it's important really institutionally. And then I'll say this, and I tell people this all the time, that you never know where you may want to be 5 years from now, right? And so to the extent, you know, at some point, you may want to leave the institution and move to a different institution. I mean, that's natural, right? A lot of people, that's what folks do. And so again, just, you know, showing these other schools that you can teach a variety of courses, it may make you more appealing to other schools as you try to, you know, if for whatever reason in your life you feel the need to move on, that it then positions you to do that in ways that would be different than if you hadn't done all that stuff. And I think for many of us, particularly for people of color, right? I think the advice that we have gotten has been, and it gets back to your question, Renee, about asking, you know, advocating for yourself, because there's a tension between that and, you know, telling folks do more than what's expected of you, right? And that was the advice I was given. Yep. I remember they want you to teach this class and this class. Hey, should I do it? You should do it because you want to show them that whatever they try to throw at you, you can do it. All right. And I'm not saying it's the healthiest advice, but the point is there's also this mentality of how do we survive in this institution? If I say no, how are they going to view that, you know, later on when I'm trying to go up for promotion? And let me show them that really nothing phases me. incredibly unhealthy. Let me be clear about it. But, I think that we are now at a point where advocating for ourselves is a much healthier route, but also trying to still exceed, expectations in some ways, right? That is, if you're up for promotion and they have set these sort of standards for you, minimum standards, my advice is to try to just, exceed them a little bit so that you create some safe space for yourself. That's all. But,
So you're
that's a whole other
talking
conversation.
you're talking about promotion, and you talked about tenure a little bit. So we know, right, that not every school has a single tenure track, right?
Right.
Lots of schools have clinical tenure and quote regular tenure, or they have tenure and contract, right? Like no tenure at all, despite the rough parity of positions that the standards require. And so when you were thinking about making the jump, so you had to make the jump from WashU because that was a visit.
It was a 1-year visit, right?
Right. When you were thinking about making the jump from WashU and you were looking at where you might go, did it matter to you at all whether you could be tenure track as a clinician or not? Did you care about that in terms of your career trajectory?
Security position mattered. Okay. So security position could be through a long-term contract or tenure. And I don't think I was so focused on tenure versus long-term contract. I did want to go to a place where I would have security of position. That was really what was important to me. And within our clinical community, right? I mean, we have many folks who say, look, this whole tenure track thing is not for me. That's not what I'm about. Tenure is kind of a way that makes people soft. I also don't want to sort of have to take on all those, everything that it is and everything that it means, right? So I want to be clear about that within our community that, when we advocate, we did, I know Lindsay referred to our work with CLIA, but we were advocating really for security of position, right? And whether it's long-term contract, whether it's, tenure track, clinical tenure, non-clinical tenure, whatever it is. But yeah, I think my focus is on security of position because, I wanted to do, I want to write.
So let me just jump in there for a second. Yeah. How do people find that out, right? So if I am a clinician thinking about making a jump, thinking about making a move to another school, how do I know what I'm looking for, right? Yeah. If I'm not looking for a unitary tenure track, what am I looking for?
Yeah, great question. So I think that, one of the beautiful things about our clinical community is, you can tap into anybody and ask these questions, right? You don't even have to know the people to ask these questions to. So I do know that David Santa Croce and Bob Kewen have they have a resource, the C-Cell resource, but they can break down every single school and tell you long-term contract, tenure, clinical tenure, et cetera, right? So you can reach out to them. CLIA, which is the Clinical Legal Education Association, reach out to the CLIA Board of Directors, and they have a whole mentoring program. And quite honestly,
CLEA, everybody on the call.
Good point. CLEA, clinical, yeah. But also, quite honestly, again, and I say this in all sincerity, I think we've all benefited from the mentorship that this community has provided from folks who we didn't know, who just have offered everything to all of us, because we wouldn't be where we are without that. But, you literally, and I put myself out there, you could send me an email, right? I'm sure, Renee, you would say the same. Lindsay, you say the same, right? Shirley would say the same. Serge would say the same, right? But literally, you could reach out to folks at any school who've been doing it for a while and just reach out to them and say, hey, I would love to talk about the trajectory or things I should be thinking about when I go on the market, or all these different things I should be thinking, what should I be doing, right? And I guarantee you every single person would say, cool, let's have a conversation, let's talk. That is, it's about access to information. I think it's our responsibility to provide that information.
Right. So talking about that for a little bit, because when you were saying you can reach out to Bob and you can reach out to David and you can reach, right?
Yeah.
That reminds me, I remember after I became a clinician, I remember going to my first clinical conference.
Right.
And I found that to be such an intimidating experience.
Yes.
It seems like everybody else knew everybody.
Right.
Everybody, hugs and kisses and, oh, let's go grab drinks. And I felt like the new kid at school who didn't know anyone, just kind of walking around from session to session, trying to figure out what I wanted to watch and do at the conference, right? Yeah. Our conference is important. So I know you have had lots of leadership experience, Yeah. Would you advise that people push past that point of discomfort and engage in conferences, engage in leadership roles when they open up at organizations?
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I remember the same thing happening. And that has been and I see that Lindsay put something about SEALs, and look at the SEALs as well. That has been what you point to, Renee. It has been a sort of ongoing criticism and reflection, right, of the clinical conference. That is, there are all these folks who know each other, and then, there are the other folks who are brand new who don't know anybody. And anybody who's been new to that conference has had that experience, right? This is something that the clinical community has recognized as an issue. And I think with COVID, I haven't been to a conference in a while because of COVID, so I don't know to what extent that's better now than it used to be. But, in the spirit of reflection, that's something that has been talked about. Yeah. So on the one hand, yes, I would say try to push past the discomfort, but on the other hand, I cannot let sort of the experienced clinical community off the hook, right? They need to be really cognizant of it and reach out. And, there are a couple of lunches. There's that lunch where everyone introduces the new people from their school, and, you have all the affinity group meetings, and you have the small group meetings, and then you have the CLIA meeting. And so it's hard for me to say, break through the discomfort, because I know what it's like to be uncomfortable in those situations. And you can't tell me to push through because it's just awkward and uncomfortable. All I can say is that we all need to continuously do better. But I think it's certainly a lot better now than it used to be. That's my sense. But again, I will say, here's what I'll say in hindsight, that I guarantee you that when you reach out, if you feel that you have to reach out and you have the burden of reaching out, it will be reciprocated in ways that it will, any sort of discomfort will fade away, because this community is just like that. This community knows that it has this obligation to pass on and to share and to lift everybody up, right? Like, I think that's part of it, is being kind of like the underdog in legal education, right? Like, we know what it's like to scrap and have to fight for everything that we've been able to earn, right? Like, we have to grab everything from these schools, and as a result, we never forget that, and we because we were in those shoes. I think, again, we just, I think we all understand the obligation to be there for everybody. Yeah. And I say that in all sincerity.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the first year is the worst.
Yeah.
But after the first year, you're going to see somebody, and you're definitely going to feel more comfortable. And then it is amazing how quickly you become the old guard. Right? Like, it's amazing how quickly you are now going to the conferences, and you're no longer the new kid on the block. You're the one like setting up the cocktails and the dinners and the
No, it's crazy. It's crazy you say that. So, your question about leadership. Yeah, I would recommend that if you're interested in a leadership position and you see it, there's no, I have to be doing this for 3 years or 5 years. No, just go ahead and try to grab it. I would say that when I was new, one piece of advice that I was given was to try to establish a name for yourself, right? And it could be in scholarship, or it could be just in the clinical community. Doesn't have to be both, right? But really, you want people to know your name. And, you and I were both in CLIA and both held board positions. It was, and we did it at early times in our careers. And I think we both felt that our voices as as people of color, but also as younger clinicians, was really necessary. but also it then allowed us to meet all these other people, right? And then then all of a sudden you tap through all these other things. And, there's CLIA, there's a AALS clinical section. I mean, there are a whole bunch of different, organizations and that, we could easily provide to net the names of.
What would you say about people also going to the other ones, right? So ALS Annual and Lawn Society, right? Like, would you suggest that they do those two or focus on the clinical, if they've got a limited number of conference hours?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. So I think probably depends on your school, right? So look, if your school's going to send you all these conferences, why not go? Right? Like if your school is just flush and say, hey, just go to every conference, just go to it. But if you were to say, hey, I have a limited travel budget and I can only go to one conference a year, right? I would go to the clinical conference.
Yeah.
Because we also learn about, there's so much we learn at the clinical conferences about Portugal. And I'm sorry, I said Portugal only because Lindsay, I'm reading your chat at the time. And I don't know, you just pointed me out that this conference is in Lisbon, Portugal. So I'm like, I don't know why. But you learn a lot about pedagogy, right? So you learn about, because the other thing, Renee, is if you don't do a fellowship, it's not like there's a crash course in how to teach.
Right.
And the same goes for non-clinical faculty. It's not like there's a crash course, like how do you actually do what we're supposed to in the classroom? It's not like you're certified, right, as a teacher. And so the clinical conference, you learn a lot, we learn a lot about how to teach, like pedagogy, and we learn a lot about scholarship, and you could present a work in progress in a room that's totally supportive of you, right? There's nobody who's trying to rip your paper apart. And then you network and you meet people, which becomes really, really important just to sustain you, but also in terms of your trajectory, right? These are people now who could speak on your behalf. So I would say of the one conference, if you could only go to one conference initially, I would say go to the clinical conference. And outside of the main AALS conference in January, it's actually the biggest conference of any, in the profession. So I would say go to that conference. I would say go to that conference.
Is flying by. I just realized we have 10 minutes left, which alarms me because I have like 9,000 more things to ask you. So what I am going to say is I'm going to say to the audience, if you have questions, post them in the chat. I will try to get to them, but I am also going to try to get through the 9,000 other things that I have to ask you, Michael. So you were talking about leadership, you were talking about clinical teaching. We talked a little bit earlier about writing.
Yeah.
Talked about unitary tenure, right? So for people who are on either a unitary tenure track or a clinical tenure track that actually requires scholarly writing, how do you balance all this stuff? How do you balance teaching a new clinic? Maybe you've decided to throw a podium class into the mix during your first 3, 4, 5 years while you're still on the tenure climb. Maybe you step into some national leadership roles. You're trying to write too, right? What's the right balance? How do you get to a place where you're like, okay, I'm striking exactly the appropriate kind of ratio of energy expenditure here?
I don't know if any of us have found that bag of magic dust yet, right?
Right? I'm exhausted.
Yeah. It's really, really hard. And it's really, really hard. And you could ask 10 people, they're going to tell you 10 different things. But mentoring is really, really important. And when I say mentoring, I'm speaking very, very broadly. So I'll give you a couple of examples, right? So there's the Clinical Law Review Writers Workshop, right? Which takes place it's either late September, early October each year, right? This is an opportunity for you to present a very, very rough draft of an article. I think that sometimes, and I get it, we're not comfortable sharing something unless we feel like it's at a certain point because we feel that someone's going to rip it up. Right. So the point is, I think, is looking for, what are some places where I can get real support in the scholarship? And we can get to the time in a second, because I think that's a way to actually force yourself to think about it, right? But the Clinical Law Review Writers Workshop, you present, you have a draft, could be a really rough draft. you're in a room with 4 people, 5 people for a day, and, you get amazing feedback on a really, really rough draft. The clinical conference also has a works in progress component. Again, you get lots of support. You have to think about what is I need to talk about, what can I present, force you to think about it. The SEALS conference, which Lindsay also put in the chat, also has a works in progress component. So I think step one is, where can I even talk about my scholarship or an idea where I can get support, right? And then part of it is, quite honestly, and it's easier said than done, is trying to block out some time in your schedule, even if it is, and this is what I say during the school year, and I get it, everything's hectic, even if it is like 2 hours a week, right? Where, you could block an hour here and a block an hour there. This is all feet, right? And in your calendars, you put class. Like you mark it as class because nothing's going to interfere with your class. Like, and it's just 1 or 2 hours a week, you're just thinking about it. And maybe you're writing a sentence, but you're just thinking about it. Because I think with scholarship, you just always want to think about it. And then quite honestly, I hate to say it, but, when there's if there's a winter break where you get a little bit of time, then you can start really sort of putting some stuff on paper. Then obviously you have your summer break as well. You have spring break. That is, you're looking for pockets of time where you could say, okay, I'm going to spend this hour thinking about something. Because I think that often we can get so intimidated by, I need an hour to write. It's actually hard to write in an hour, right? On the other hand, some of us say, well, when I get 8 hours, I'll be able to write. And then we don't find those 8 hours. And that's why I say, I think everybody will tell you something different. All I can say is it's a real grind. It's a real grind.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a real grind. That's why this is harder than other forms of teaching, because we have clients, we have everything else. And some of us may not have the support within our institutions. The other thing I'd say is, and again, this is, all things we've learned over the years, is sometimes, you may devote a class to the subject that you're writing about, right? Sometimes you may say to your students, hey, can you spare me 2 hours? I just want to run something past you. You could use your students in that way. Some of us have created seminars around something we want to write about. That's actually another reason why people create seminars is, hey, I have this scholarly idea. Let me take the seminar to sort of go deep into it. And that carves out some time as well. It's just really hard. I mean, there's no one answer for you. And I do think the other thing I want to say is, I do think folks like us, Renee, I think mentoring is a two-way street. And I got some advice a couple of years ago, which you get this great advice and you don't follow up. But, we need to look to some of our brand new folks to be our mentors, right? Because they have a pulse on things that we just don't have a pulse on. And it could include, how do you create different spaces? So one of the things I see people doing now, and we've done it a little bit, Renee, is you have folks at other schools who, subject area wise, maybe have similar research interests, and they get together. They may meet twice a year, right? That is, they have a support group to facilitate their scholarship. And okay, we're going to meet in December. I know that I have to have 3 pages by December. And then we're going to meet again in June. I know I need to have 10 pages in June, right? And putting that into your schedules could then force us to find time where maybe before we didn't think we had.
Yeah.
So things like,
I think, want to encourage that model. So we have been in MACLR, the Mid-Atlantic Criminal Law
something research collective,
since what, like 05, 06?
Something like that,
right? And it literally started as 3 of us sitting on the floor in your apartment eating sandwiches from Subway, talking about what we wanted to write about. But I think that if you were going to do it with friends, I really want to encourage people on the call to be very, very, very rigorous about it, right? Respect your colleagues, respect their time, take it seriously. When you do have a summer session or a winter session, actually prep for it like you're prepping to go to a conference. Hold those deadlines. Don't let people say, oh, well, could we just push it back a week? Or I'm not going to submit this time, right? If people are not writing, if they're not doing what they need to be doing, kick them out the group, right? Tell them that they have got that at the cost of attendance.
And we've done that. And let me be clear. They don't have to be your they don't even have to be your friends, right? This could be people who, you know what, you know that their scholarship aligns with yours or their interests align with yours. Hey, look, do you mind forming a group? Let's at least have a conversation with each other about it and hold ourselves accountable. So there's that too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So with 2 minutes left, and I literally cannot believe this hour went as quickly as it did. I have so much more stuff to ask you. I have 2 minutes left. So with 2 minutes left, I'm going to ask, is there anything that you wished you had known on the front end of your trajectory as a clinician that you think might be helpful to the people listening in?
Actually, I think it's what we talked about before about advocating for yourself. You know, I think many of us, when we got these jobs, it's kind of like your eyes are wide open. It's all brand new. And you don't realize that the things you could have asked for that you didn't ask for. And there's always things that, you know, still to this day, I feel like there are things that I don't know that quite other faculty members at my institution knows, right? So I think that, you know, really seeking out people within your own institutions to get the scuttlebutt on all things that are important is really, really important. And I'm still not good at it to this day. I think that that's really, really important. And then the other thing is really that you can only get this by experiences is really understanding how the demands on your time change over the course of time. That is, you're still as busy, but you may be really, really busy in really different ways. And so what I'll say to that is, you should always, if you're asked to do something, or you think something's a good idea to take on, whether it's being a reporter for, you know, whatever organization or taking on a board position or whatever, you should just run it past somebody rather than just sort of taking things on, right? Because over the course of time, you want everything you do to be well worth your time. And I think we have done some things where you're like, oh my gosh, why did I sign up for this? Seriously, in ways that have not been productive. So I think asking questions about everything is really, really important, and finding people who could give you that sound advice.
Okay.
Yep.
So with that brings us to the end of our hour. My friend, I want to thank you. This was an amazing conversation, a great launch to the Conversations with Clinicians series. If you guys look over into the chat, Lindsay has posted the next session that we're having and the link to the next session. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, but mostly thank you, my friend Mike Pinard. Love you, brother. Thank you for this time.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
And Tiffany Smith, please tell David Singleton I said hello. You put that in the chat. Please let him tell him I said hi. There you go. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Hey, Robin.
Hi, folks. If anyone has
Hey,
any
Robin, how you
questions
doing,
about
Robin?
anything, I can stay on for a little bit. If anyone wants to just connect and say hi. Michael, Tiffany is our incoming managing attorney. She starts next Wednesday for our clinical.
Oh,
career.
awesome. Yeah, so Tiffany put something in the chat about David Singleton. And David Singleton and I started at NDS together way back. So we were on Team 5. So yeah. I still keep in contact with him. Yeah.
Yeah. I worked at the Ohio, well, during law school, I did his clinic.
Awesome.
And then he convinced me to come work with him too. So I started the women's program at the Ohio Justice and Policy Center.
Yeah. Okay.
And he raves about her too. And then we got Robin, who's a UDC grad.
I know Robin and I, we're doing some work together on, we actually have a joint case together. So yeah, we have a client in common. So yep.
Amazing.
And Shirley's doing amazing things. Shirley's leading the world right now. And Serge is looking more distinguished, every year, So there you go.
You're so glad you put your video on, Serge.
Can I ask a brief question? And I got here a little late, so it may have already been asked and answered. So someone like me who wants to get into clinical teaching, have explored a ton of options with a ton of people and get so much mixed advice. So for instance, when I talk to judges, they always say, oh, get involved with your law school, take this track, but don't do anything for free. You know what I'm saying? If they want you to be there, they'll pay you. And then you're like, that's not my goal. My goal is to get the experience to get there, right? And then you talk to other clinicians, and then you feel they're like, hey, come along and do this thing. However, be careful with your time because you're going to get stuck in the clinic. You're going to love it. But again, you're going to pause at the drawing it for free, right? Now, don't get me wrong, I don't care about those conversations. I care about the advice I get from those conversations. But to see like go to this, the CLIA or the SCLA thing and all of those things, and you're not part of a faculty or a clinical education program, and you're not even a contract. I know a lot of these applications say, give us your affiliation. How does someone looking for that experience merge that wedge to get into those environments?
So I'll just give you my thoughts, and then I'm sure Michael and Lindsay and others on the call have other thoughts, right? So I would say consider, if you are not sure you want to actually teach, consider doing an adjunct position or a visit to give you some term limited experience that will allow you to say, okay, I understand this role. I understand what I'm being asked to do in this role, and I actually like it. I would not, and this is just me, again, other people may have different advice. I would actually not recommend going to conferences before you are actually an academic as a vehicle for getting into academia. I just don't think it's that productive. Instead, I would focus on, if you're going to a school that actually has a scholarship requirement, I would focus on getting that first article out, right? Like the market was very, very, very different when I went on the market. Like I said, I had no publications. I had the thought of an idea of an article, and that was it, and got hired. I don't think that's the market anymore. I think that the market currently is looking for at least one article. And that's just that's the coin of the realm. So I would focus on getting that knocked out. And then that is probably, then you can just go on the market, straight on the market, with or without teaching experience.
Yeah. And just to add to that, even short of adjuncting, you can just teach a class, right? I mean, that's also just another opportunity. Come to my class if you want. And that's just to be clear, guest teach does not mean you are there for the entire semester. Oh yeah, I'm talking about right.
Come in for one class.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And then the other thing I think we've seen, I know, at OPD, when you have summer interns, right? I mean, to the extent you can supervise any of them, because when people go on the market, they could also say, have you taught before? Well, no, I haven't taught, but I've supervised these summer interns, and it was an intensive summer program and did X, Y, and Z and provided feedback and did all that. That is, I basically did clinical teaching, but in the context of my job as well. So yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. If that
Thank
is
you,
it, I
Nicole.
just want to thank everybody.
Thanks,
All right.
everyone. Thanks for
Bye,
joining
gang.
us for the first session. We did manage to record almost all of it. So if you have other folks for whom you think this might be helpful or interesting, you can definitely share. And thank you for being our inaugural audience.